Are you a victim of propaganda? Most people would say no, and I think they are wrong. Because across human history, leaders of every successful empire knew how important it was to influence what the population believes in. We often think the only difference between propaganda and misinformation is intent. This couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, there's a theory that explains how propaganda can make the belief of the ruling class seem normal and natural. Antonio Gramsci called this process cultural hegemony. And if empires separated by thousands of years managed to do it, why do we assume the most advanced society in human history wouldn't? Before we get to modern societies, we first need to understand how propaganda worked before technology, because once we see the same motivations repeat, it becomes easier to look at modern propaganda with less bias. In chapter 1, I will start with how ancient leaders tried to shape the views of their populations. We'll do that using three pillars that will organize every historical example hereafter. Pillar 1. Propaganda that helps a leader retain or get to power by making himself seem like someone that understands the target audience's needs. One example for this pillar is Julius Caesar. Recognizing that the working class was unsatisfied with the Senate, Caesar focused on creating a bond with those that felt ignored by Rome's ruling class. He did that by giving land to veterans, financing festivals, and introducing reforms that cancelled about 1/4 of all property debt. On top of that, Caesar made the state grain system more organized, which allowed Rome to have a more reliable food supply for its poorest citizens. Those actions helped him gain popularity among the public, which gave him strong influence on the citizen assemblies, where ordinary citizens could vote on laws and elect magistrates. Because of this, Caesar was often able to advance his desired laws even when the Senate didn't agree with them. To have control over public information, he introduced the Acta Diurna, which was basically a newspaper that reported senatorial proceedings and other political events. Before the Acta Diurna, those proceedings were not visible to the average Roman citizen. So when a popular reform was delayed, Romans could now see who stood against them. This put pressure on the senators while at the same time making Caesar seem like an honest and transparent leader that was acting on behalf of the public. While Caesar built support among the public, his influence made many senators fear that Rome's republican system was at risk of being replaced with a monarchy. This fear, alongside other issues, resulted in his assassination. This shows that in Pillar 1, to succeed as a leader, it is not enough to only win over the working class. You must also manage the groups most capable of threatening your position. That is what his successor Augustus understood when, instead of accepting the title dictator for life, he called himself the first citizen and claimed that the Senate and the Roman people still governed Rome. In the constitutional settlement of 27 BC, he allowed senators to control the empire's peaceful provinces. Augustus, on the other hand, controlled the frontier provinces where almost all of Rome's legions were stationed. This left the senators satisfied despite Augustus still having authority over the military. Historians often agree that Augustus actually ended up having more power than Caesar ever did. So why didn't the Senate oppose Augustus the way they did Caesar? Because unlike Caesar, Augustus allowed the Senate to feel like they had status and influence, giving them no reason to remove him. Pillar 2. Rather than acting as the expression of pre-existing needs, the leader or ideology becomes the one around which those needs are reorganized. Trust is therefore built through retrospective justification. While Augustus had actions that would fit this pillar too, Alexander the Great provides a clearer example. Alexander tried to associate his image with divinity. Ancient writers claim that he did that by allowing only a few artists to portray him, those being Lysippus in sculpture, Apelles in painting, and Pygmalion in gem engraving. Through the mass production of silver coins, he was portrayed with the ram horns of Zeus Ammon or the lion skin of Heracles, which normalized his association with divine lineage. Additionally, Alexander traveled with the historian and philosopher Callisthenes. His reports of Alexander's invasions helped glorify him, while also making the war against Persia seem like a heroic mission against barbarian enemies. We see here that those actions were not about aligning with the public. They were more about making Alexander seem like someone the population was required to to follow because of the divine and heroic status he was associated with. On top of that, because his invasions were framed as divine missions against barbarian forces, his expansions could be seen as necessary. Alexander is a good example to understand the pillar, yet I didn't want to go in depth here because I believe Trajan as the second example has way more parallels to modern propaganda. When Augustus died, he left documents advising future leaders of Rome to not expand the empire beyond its current borders. For nearly a century, the Roman population became used to the stability and peace of the Pax Romana and didn't have a need for further expansion. So to create a justification for the first war in 101 CE, Trajan stopped the yearly payments that Rome sent to Dacia as part of an earlier peace agreement. Dacia had used this money to manage relations with northern tribes to keep peace with them, yet without these funds this was no longer possible, and instead Dacia decided to protect its borders by forming alliances with other tribes. Trajan then told the Senate about those alliances and argued that they were a coalition that was targeting Rome. Yet Roman military preparations had begun years before the invasion, showing that those alliances were likely just a justification for a war that was already being planned. For the second war in 105 CE, Trajan used the terms of the 102 peace agreement to force Dacia to accept Roman troops inside its borders, which resulted with the troops reducing the kingdom's independence. So eventually the Dacians chose to rebuild their walls and recruit troops to resist. Trajan used this breach of the agreement as a justification to invade and destroy the kingdom. After those wars, Trajan built a column named after himself, which acted like an archive to depict the Dacians as barbaric by portraying them with long and unkempt hair and beards, which for the Romans at the time seemed uncivilized. In addition, this art was often put beside portrayals of the clean-shaven and organized Roman army. The Dacians were shown burning and destroying things, while the Roman army was shown building, which was meant to reinforce the view that the Dacians were a threat to Roman peace. I found this part interesting because you will later see that the same approach is similar to what the Nazis did. Finally, the tons of gold and silver stolen from those expansions was used to improve Roman infrastructure and made welfare programs like the Alimenta possible, which helped children in poverty. This made the Roman population in hindsight perceive the expansions as necessary for the improvement and safety of the Roman Empire. Pillar 3. Here, collective grief is used to achieve the desired response from a population. Following the death of his companion Antinous, Hadrian tried to deify him. But because the Senate controlled who could be deified in Rome, this wasn't possible because it would have gone against the Roman tradition that only emperors and their immediate family can be deified. So instead, Hadrian used his control over the eastern provinces to deify Antinous in Egypt. This was possible because in the Egyptian traditions, someone that drowned in the Nile was seen as sacred, which was the case with Antinous. So Hadrian founded Antinopolis in Middle Egypt, giving its citizens privileges like the possibility of intermarriage with local populations. This allowed children with Greek and Egyptian parents to retain Greek status as if both of their parents were Greek. Across the Greek East, participation in the cult expanded because Hadrian had long aligned himself with Greek culture, and Antinous himself was Greek. His deification was therefore easier to be integrated into the Greek traditions of hero worship and ruler cults. Through the creation of Antinopolis, Hadrian made it possible for different cultures to feel united under one identity. In Chapter 2, we'll look at a period in history where past leaders were studied with more focus on political success than morality. One of the most influential voices of this period is Machiavelli. Machiavelli lived during the Italian Wars and political instability, so rather than promoting manipulation or brutality for selfish reasons, like sometimes interpreted, Machiavelli actually tried to give advice for future leaders on how to lead a stable state. To achieve this, he analyzed historical examples, including some of the leaders we looked at earlier, to understand how power and perception were managed. An example for why studying the management of public perception can be beneficial is visible in the contrast between Napoleon Bonaparte and Louis XVI. While the causes for the French Revolution were mostly economical, part of the reason the anger of the population was directed at Louis was because he had failed to manage how the population perceived his leadership. Louis XVI failed in Pillar 1 by being unable to address the needs of the population. Machiavelli said, "All the same, while a ruler can't expect to inspire love when making himself feared, he must avoid arousing hatred. Actually, being feared is perfectly compatible with not being hated, and a ruler won't be hated if he keeps his hands off his subjects' property and their women." When a series of bad harvests and disasters, including the hailstorm on July 13, 1788, drove food shortages, the price of bread increased beyond what an average worker could afford. Instead of acting on behalf of the population's needs in such a situation, the first estate's clergy and the second estate's nobility continued to benefit from a tax system that burdened the third estate. Louis XVI and his ministers actually tried to reform the tax system, but because the nobles held most of the legal power, those attempts failed. So obviously this would also be a failure in Pillar 2. Louis XVI reliance on the divine right of kings is similar to Alexander the Great's use of divine association. Yet Machiavelli wrote that laws and religious teachings require good customs to be accepted by a population. And in the case of Louis XVI, much of the population was in a state of survival, where expecting good customs was no longer reliable. Yet despite all this, many French citizens still accepted a monarchy with Louis XVI as head of state. So what changed? By 1791, Louis XVI had lost much of his power, which put him in a position where he had to approve laws passed by the National Assembly, even if he didn't agree with them. For that reason, he tried to leave Paris with his family in June 1791 to reach royalist troops near the eastern border to restore his power and potentially receive foreign support. He never achieved this because him and his family were recognized and arrested in Varennes before being returned to Paris. On top of that, Louis XVI left behind a declaration criticizing the revolution and their constitution. In Pillar 3, a leader can use an event to shape the perception of a population. Here we see the same when revolutionary politicians used this event to increase views opposed to monarchy among the public, making it possible for Louis XVI to be tried and executed for treason after further events during the revolution. After the revolution, France went back to a centralized authority, with Napoleon Bonaparte becoming emperor in 1804. So I asked myself, why would a population that overthrew a monarchy accept an emperor? Napoleon gained his power first as First Consul and was later elected emperor, winning the election with 99% voting for him. Historians agree that those votes were manipulated, yet I'd still categorize it into Pillar 1, because they allowed him to appear like the entire population wanted him in that position. Also, he replaced the class-based system with equality in front of the law, removing privileges like tax exemptions and making careers no longer based on lineage and instead on skill or education. Similar to Caesar using the Acta Diuno, Napoleon Bonaparte used newspapers to publish reports of his military campaigns. Those reports described the wars in detail and were edited to put Napoleon in a better light by, for example, exaggerating enemy casualties. On the other hand, losses were often minimized or left out entirely. In addition, after getting to power, he reduced the number of newspapers covering politics in Paris from around 73 to just 13, with only 4 remaining by 1811, all of them being under censorship by the government. Looking at it from our definition of Pillar 2, the reason the French population could accept Napoleon Bonaparte's wars, even though they were frustrated at Louis XVI investment in the American Revolution, was because Louis XVI involvement felt like a waste of national funds, while much of the population was facing poverty. Napoleon Bonaparte's wars, on the other hand, could be presented as necessary to defend France and the achievements of the revolution using the methods we talked about in Pillar 1. Similar to Trajan, Napoleon was the leader of a population that had little desire for war, especially after years of poverty and a revolution. Yet, because Napoleon was improving the state of many lives in France, the expansion of the French Empire could be accepted. In the next examples, we recognize actions of Napoleon that would fit Pillar 3. During the Brumaire coup, Napoleon and his allies spread the rumors that France faced the threat of a Jacobin uprising. One of those allies was Joseph Fouché, who was the Minister of Police and helped spread those claims through police reports and the press. The Jacobins had ruled during the Reign of Terror only a few years earlier, so the idea that they were preparing to regain power seemed believable. Because of those claims, the legislative councils were moved to Saint-Cloud for their safety, and Napoleon was placed in command for the troops protecting them. With this, Napoleon had control over the military forces that would later carry out the coup. At the time, France was governed by the Directory, made up of 5 officials known as directors. 2 of those directors were already part of the coup, while a third was pressured into resigning. The remaining 2 directors refused to resign and were detained by Napoleon's troops. This made it possible for the Directory to later be replaced with a new government led by Napoleon as first consul. Now that we have both examples, we can ask why Louis was executed and Napoleon celebrated. On one hand, it was the obvious economic improvements Napoleon was able to achieve, but on the other hand, the way they shaped the population's perception was also important. We saw that Louis XVI, even when well-meaning, understood his power as something that was given to him and something he didn't need to preserve due to his Catholic belief in the divine right of kings. Napoleon likely thrived because he understood how fragile power can actually be, and unlike Louis, studied how to preserve power, including how to control the views of a population. We can say that because historical sources confirm that Napoleon read and studied Machiavelli, even allegedly saying Machiavelli is the only author one can read. In Chapter 3, we look at Nazi Germany, where propaganda became part of the government through the Reich Ministry of Enlightenment and Propaganda. While organized propaganda had earlier examples, including its use by Britain and the United States during World War I and by Mussolini's Italy, Nazi Germany was one of the earliest examples to make propaganda a centralized part of the government. After Germany's defeat in World War I and the Great Depression, many Germans had lost confidence in the Weimar government. The Nazis profited from this with actions I would categorize within Pillar 1. In 1932, the NSDAP created a campaign called Hitler over Germany, where Hitler traveled across Germany using an airplane, speaking in multiple cities in a single day. This made him reach millions of people in just a few weeks, some of whom had never seen a national politician before, allowing him to create a lasting impression, especially because airplanes at the time were still a new form of travel and were seen as risky. The NSDAP also used different messages for different audiences. For workers, as an example, they created posters with slogans like work and bread, where the message was to create jobs as an answer to unemployment. Other messages were in a similar way made to appeal to the concerns of farmers, women, small business owners, and other groups. Yet while those messages portrayed Hitler as a savior figure for Germany, the NSDAP also used posters, speeches, and even their own newspaper to blame the Weimar government, communists, and the Jewish population for the country's decline. The way Nazi ideology was normalized can be categorized within Pillar 2. One way through which the NSDAP achieved this was through the Volksempfänger, a radio developed under the direction of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. To ensure that the working class could afford it, the regime sold the baseline model for 76 Reichsmark, around half the price of a standard radio for that time. In 1938, the regime introduced an even cheaper model, called Deutscher Kleinempfänger, which cost around 35 Reichsmark. After its introduction, 65% of families owned a radio, compared to the 25% beforehand, allowing Nazi broadcasts to reach millions of homes on a daily basis. The radios were engineered with weak reception, making it difficult to access foreign stations. To further prevent other perspectives, listening to foreign stations was made illegal. If caught, one could face imprisonment, or in some cases even the death penalty. Because of this, people could only listen to the state-controlled German stations that mainly consisted of the speeches of Hitler, military marches, and misinformation targeting Jews and state enemies. In this way, Nazi ideology became part of everyday life and was gradually normalized among the population. Another way to influence the population was the use of caricatures. The state media portrayed the Jewish population and dissidents as both inferior and destructive to the social order. By reinforcing these depictions alongside idealized portrayals of the German citizen, the propaganda made a connection between national prosperity and the removal of these targeted groups. Pillar 3 was used in the rise to power and while holding it. After the Reichstag fire, Adolf Hitler and the Reichstag's President Göring used the fire as a pretext to present the threat of a communist coup to President Hindenburg. Because Hindenburg was already anti-communist, they faced little resistance and secured his signature on the Reichstag fire decree under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed the president to bypass the parliament and sign decrees during a national crisis. Hitler, as chancellor, used this to remove civil rights like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press, which allowed him to arrest thousands of political opponents. A year later, Hitler faced internal problems with the Sturmabteilung, or short SA. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, wanted to increase the SA's influence over the German armed forces. Yet the leadership of the regular army saw the SA as a threat that was getting too powerful. To get rid of this conflict, Hitler decided to order the execution of the entire SA leadership, including Ernst Röhm, during what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, which ended with the execution of at least 85 individuals total. Hitler justified this by claiming Röhm was planning a coup and retrospectively made the executions legal through a law called Law Regarding Measures of State Self-Defense. The executions ended up lowering the internal opposition within the Nazi movement and helped Hitler gain a better position with the military leadership. Before we look at today's propaganda, we first have to understand who the propagandist is. And the truth is, it's kinda complicated. Modern propaganda has many independent propagandists, meaning many messages can oppose each other. So what I will try to do is find where all those messages converge. What I found is that even when different propagandists promote different messages, they often encourage the same behavior, because encouraging that behavior benefits them within the system they exist in. Gard S. Jowett and Victoria O'Donnell defined propaganda as the deliberate systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. Using this definition, we can look into modern propaganda and understand it through the three pillars. In modern societies, influence is divided across different institutions, so it becomes easy to assume that propaganda can be easily recognized. The used definition is important because the common understanding of propaganda is often seen through the lens of failed systems, and people therefore assume that the propaganda they encounter will be similar to, for example, fascist systems of the past. With most of us living in capitalistic democracies, this type of propaganda wouldn't make sense, because a democratic society represents different values and goals than a fascist one. Instead, the propaganda we encounter would originate from the ones profiting from the system the most. As Frederick Jameson noted regarding capitalist propaganda, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. In the modern world, there are two levels of propaganda that each can be explained with the three pillars. The first being macro actions that make questioning the system unreasonable, and the second being actions to ensure participation in society. Level 1, what we can categorize within Pillar 1, is the fact that democracy by default presents political outcomes as the will of the people. So when an elected leader fails, the leader and those who supported them are criticized rather than the political system. While we see that many problems in society are not improving, the possibility of a different future keeps the trust in the system and lays the groundwork to make continued participation appealing. In the second pillar, we can find two assumptions that are often seen to make the capitalist democratic system feel the most logical. History justifies democracy, and democracy justifies capitalism. By using the failure of authoritarian and fascist regimes as examples, democracy is presented as the only reasonable conclusion after all other systems have failed. While I personally agree that democracy is the most effective political system, one must understand that not every democratic system works the same way or is equally effective, as seen with the Weimar Republic. Yet once a state is considered democratic, it is often treated as superior by default, regardless of how it functions in practice. Now, once democracy is seen as necessary, it is used to justify capitalism by making them seem related. Democracy is a political system, and capitalism an economic one, meaning they can exist independent from one another. Yet modern propaganda often treats them as if they were codependent systems. We see this during the Cold War, where the United States wanted to stop the spread of Soviet communist influence. On September 4, 1970, Salvador Allende Gossens was elected president of Chile. Because he was a Marxist, the US government viewed his victory as a threat to American geopolitical interests and corporate assets. To destabilize the country, the United States resorted to economic warfare by cutting financial support, funding opposition parties, and paying millions to the media outlets in Chile to spread misinformation about their government. These efforts created the conditions that led to the coup by the Chilean military, after which Augusto Pinochet became dictator and was responsible for the executions of 3,000 to 4,000 people and the imprisonment and torture of about 40,000. When this outcome is then later used as an example for socialist failure, the intervention of the US to destroy the economy are mostly ignored. Similar examples of intervention were also seen in the Congo, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Because of those failures, socialism is seen as a flawed economic system that isn't compatible with democratic values, making capitalism seem like the most reasonable economic system for democracy. Those same historical examples are further used through actions that can be categorized within Pillar 3. Here, collective memory is used to associate socialism and communism with crisis through education and media. This is done by taking the worst examples, such as the Soviet Union, East Germany, or now North Korea, as representative of socialism and communism, which makes it easier to generalize other socialist failures as those discussed in Pillar 2. So when someone becomes aware of the discussed interventions, they in many cases no longer require justification, because they assume socialism results in a failed society, and therefore fighting it is seen as a sufficient excuse. Level 2. What we can categorize within Pillar 1 is the reality that today a politician no longer needs to guess what the population believes in, because data collection, algorithms, and political strategists make it easier to understand the voter base. That doesn't mean that politicians no longer believe in their position. However, it reduces the distinction between genuine alignment and performance. While it makes it easier to gain influence, it also becomes more difficult to maintain it. Because once, let's say, a politician is in office, the voters have expectations they want to be met. If those expectations are not met, the politician loses support and another view or perspective gains popularity, since the population is no longer forced to stick to one leadership and instead has multiple options they can agree with. While politicians can be categorized within Pillar 1, the parties they represent will be in Pillar 2. Why in Pillar 2? Because when a population expresses needs, those needs almost never come with an execution plan. This is where parties share solutions or ideas the population might have no knowledge in. They may not even agree with them, yet still accept them because they assume it will fix their problems. Yet as with Pillar 1, popularity isn't guaranteed forever. This can be seen in changing coalitions in parliamentary systems such as in Germany, or in alternating party control like in the US. The presence of multiple parties creates what we know as the illusion of choice. Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman described a propaganda model that shows how filters in the media tend to favor perspectives aligned with state and corporate interests. So while on paper the population is deciding who gets to power, this decision is being made in an environment where those in power present you with different options and you just decide which of those options you like best. Another thing we see is that politicians often gain influence by portraying opposition parties as useless or even harmful. While this is a standard strategy to gain influence, it is amplified by media environments. We see this with entertainment platforms. Because they prioritize profit, users are shown content they either strongly agree or disagree with, as those are the ones that guarantee the most engagement. As a result, political participation becomes less about voting for progress and more about preventing regress. This becomes visible in the language used in politics, with liberals often calling the opposition a threat to democracy, using memory associated with fascism to make themselves seem necessary for a peaceful future, and conservatives appealing to tradition, calling the opposition a threat to their values. In both cases, support is driven by the fear that the victory of the opposition would endanger the nation. One reason for this is that many of the problems the population actually cares about can often not be fixed by just new laws and would take years of prioritization to fix, making it unrealistic for any politician to fully address within a single administration. If this were admitted, the population would have less belief that their vote could actually change anything. What can be categorized into Pillar 3 is how in a modern state there's often a villain that absorbs as much blame as possible, be it communism in the 20th century, terrorists, immigrants, the opposition party, or even like in the current situation, a country's own president. In the earlier mentioned propaganda model of Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky, one of the filters in the media they talked about is anti-communism. Their book Manufacturing Consent was written in the Cold War. So to be more accurate, the anti-communism filter is today often understood as the fear-based filter because that same mechanism works for any other external threat. While those filters describe how ideological biases can be manufactured, the propaganda model, in my opinion, didn't go into detail on what that actually results in. What we see in the 21st century is a population that seems to need someone to blame for their struggles because they were taught to perceive the system they live in as natural. And when someone perceives something as natural, they are more likely to assume that their problems are a result of external influences. Do you remember how earlier in the Napoleon passage I asked why a population that overthrew a monarchy accepted an emperor? That applies here too, because for most people, when their needs are being failed by the state, they look for whom to blame and assume removing them will improve the situation. Just like the French assumed removing Louis XVI would improve their lives. The reason for that is that in both cases the political or economic system was not what they considered flawed because they never thought to question it. And that lack of questioning is what modern propaganda is often trying to take advantage of. So are you a victim of propaganda? The answer depends on how much of what you consider common sense you are willing to question.